A tanker vanishes from international tracking systems. 3 weeks later, U.S. Marshals board the vessel off Venezuela's coast. The operation unfolds quietly, but its implications echo across global energy markets. The skipper carried 2 million barrels of crude oil, enough to supply a small nation for weeks. Market analysts estimated seizure triggered immediate volatility across trading floors. Prices spiked 3.2% within hours as traders recalibrated risk assessments. The incident demonstrated how single enforcement actions ripple through interconnected global systems. The U.S. Department of Justice framed this as enforcing sanctions against illicit trade networks. Illicit Venezuelan oil funds hostile activities, they argued. Evidence suggested the cargo violated OFAC regulations targeting Iran-Venezuela trade networks. Officials emphasized their legal authority to intercept vessels touching American financial systems. Critics see extraterritorial overreach. Maritime lawyers question jurisdiction over vessels operating in international waters. The ship sailed under a Liberian flag with no American crew aboard. International waters complicate legal authority, raising questions about whether enforcement exceeded traditional boundaries of national sovereignty. This wasn't random interdiction. Intelligence agencies tracked financial flows for months, building comprehensive cases. Satellite analysis identified suspicious reflagging patterns. The vessel changed registration 3 times in 8 months. AI-enhanced monitoring increased targeting precision dramatically. Experts estimate 70% improvement in detection capabilities over recent years. But surgical strikes carry consequences beyond immediate enforcement objectives. Global powers watched closely, calculating implications for their own interests. China condemned the seizure as economic warfare, targeting sovereign nations. Russia questioned U.S. maritime dominance and hinted at countermeasures. Even allies privately expressed concerns about precedent and potential escalation. Your energy costs may feel this ripple effect. Instability in sanctioned oil markets affects global supply chains. When major producers operate in shadows, price predictability erodes. Insurance premiums increase. Transportation costs rise. These pressures eventually reach consumer level. This isn't merely enforcement versus evasion. It's about power architecture in international systems. Who writes maritime rules? Who enforces them? Defenders cite tens of billions in prevented illicit revenue funding dangerous regimes. Skeptics warn of escalation spirals that could destabilize global commerce. The skipper seizure raised fundamental questions. Does decisive action deter illicit trade, or does it push sanctioned regimes toward more dangerous alternatives? Oil shaped geopolitical power before digital networks existed. The 1973 embargo demonstrated crude oil's extraordinary leverage over industrial economies. Nations learned that energy vulnerability carries severe consequences. These lessons informed decades of subsequent policy decisions. Venezuela nationalized oil production in 1976, seeking sovereign control over its primary resource. Iran followed suit after the 1979 revolution, fundamentally restructuring its relationship with Western energy companies. Both actions aimed to capture wealth previously extracted by foreign corporations. Washington viewed these nationalizations as threatening long-term energy security and regional stability. Sanctions emerged gradually rather than suddenly. Iran faced initial restrictions after the 1979 hostage crisis. Venezuela avoided major penalties for decades despite tensions. Hugo Chávez's election in 1999 changed strategic calculations. His government pursued increasingly anti-American policies while deepening ties with Iran and other U.S. adversaries. The sanction architecture expanded systematically. Iran faced nuclear-related restrictions starting in 2006. Financial sanctions followed in 2012, targeting oil exports directly. Venezuela entered the sanctions regime in 2017 with petroleum sector restrictions. By 2019, PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company, faced comprehensive blocking sanctions. Most recently, joint Iran-Venezuela trade networks became enforcement priorities. Each action triggered predictable reactions. Iran partnered strategically with Venezuela to circumvent restrictions. Together, they developed sophisticated evasion techniques, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, complex ownership structures obscuring beneficial owners, falsified documentation systems, and dark fleet operations avoiding tracking systems. Critics contend this escalation proves enforcement futility. Maritime security analysts warn that aggressive interdiction paradoxically increases danger. Sanctioned entities adopt riskier practices when conventional routes close. Environmental and safety hazards in international waters rise an estimated 30% under sustained pressure. Aging vessels without proper maintenance create pollution risks. Defenders argue differently. State Department officials cite disrupted revenue streams preventing hostile regimes from funding destabilizing activities unchecked. Without enforcement, they argue, weakness invites exploitation. Authoritarian governments interpret restraint as permission to expand illicit networks. Your energy infrastructure connects directly to this history. When sanctioned oil enters markets through shadows, regulatory oversight vanishes. Quality control disappears. Insurance coverage becomes murky and dispute resolution mechanisms fail. The skipper didn't emerge from vacuum. Decades of policy decisions, retaliations, and adaptations culminated in that interdiction. The question persists. Does this machinery produce security or perpetual conflict? Intelligence begins with anomalies. The skipper reflagged 3 times in 8 months, an unusual pattern suggesting deliberate concealment. Ownership transferred through Panamanian shell companies designed to obscure ultimate control. The automatic identification system went dark for 72-hour intervals, violating maritime safety protocols. Treasury analysts follow money first. Wire transfers routed through multiple jurisdictions: Cyprus, United Arab Emirates, Malaysia. Each layer obscures ultimate beneficiaries. Pattern recognition software flags inconsistencies in transaction timing and amounts. Human analysts then confirm suspicions through detailed investigation. The legal framework operates on multiple levels. Executive Order 13850 authorizes blocking Venezuelan petroleum sector assets. The Office of Foreign Assets Control designates specific vessels as sanctioned entities. Once designated, any U.S. person conducting transactions with these vessels faces potential criminal prosecution. But jurisdiction requires justification under international law. The vessel touched U.S. financial systems. Payments cleared through New York correspondent banks. That contact established legal nexus, giving American authorities enforcement jurisdiction. Without this financial connection, legal authority would remain questionable. Critics challenge this expansive interpretation of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Maritime sovereignty advocates argue U.S. law shouldn't govern vessels beyond territorial waters. The ship carried no American crew members. It sailed under foreign flag registry. Cargo originated elsewhere and was destined for non-American ports. Defenders counter that financial system access carries obligations. Voluntary use of dollar-based transactions subjects parties to American jurisdiction. Alternative payment systems exist for those wishing to avoid U.S. oversight. Participation implies acceptance of regulatory requirements. Technology transformed enforcement capabilities dramatically. Machine learning algorithms process terabytes of satellite imagery daily. Behavioral patterns emerge from massive datasets. Unusual rendezvous points. Speed changes near specific coordinates, radio silence during critical windows. AI-enhanced targeting improved dark fleet identification by approximately 70% between 2020 and 2025. Your tax dollars fund this infrastructure. Congressional appropriations for maritime enforcement tripled since 2020, reaching hundreds of millions annually. Effectiveness remains disputed among policy analysts and maritime experts. The skipper stopped transmitting on August 12th. U.S. Marshals boarded on September 3rd. 22 days of enhanced surveillance preceded interdiction. Intelligence agencies coordinated with Coast Guard and Navy assets. Nothing about the operation was accidental or spontaneous. 23 sailors called the skipper home. Filipinos, Indians, Indonesians, multinational crew earning between $800 and $1,200 monthly. None made policy decisions. None designed sanction evasion schemes. They simply worked to support families thousands of miles away. They now face detention without formal charges. Maritime law offers limited protections for crew members caught in geopolitical disputes. Legal experts estimate these sailors have less than 20% probability of resuming maritime careers quickly. Financial burdens mount rapidly. Legal fees, lost wages, and lasting reputational damage that follows them across the industry. Your household budget absorbs shocks differently, but inevitably. When enforcement disrupts sanctioned oil flows, market volatility increases across global energy markets. Gasoline prices fluctuate unpredictably. Analysis suggests sustained interdictions could drive 15% short-term price spikes at consumer level. Shipping companies navigate impossible choices daily. Should they insure vessels conducting borderline trades? Premiums skyrocket when vessels operate in gray zones. Refuse questionable contracts? Competitors quickly fill gaps. Face prosecution? Business collapses entirely, destroying decades of built reputation. Critics argue enforcement ignores human dimensions entirely. Geopolitical objectives override individual fates systematically. Defenders respond that illicit trade funds worse outcomes, terrorism financing, weapons proliferation, authoritarian regime stability. Difficult choices require weighing competing harms honestly. But some costs remain invisible in policy calculations. The Indonesian engineer who carefully planned his daughter's university tuition now faces bankruptcy. The Indian deckhand sending remittances home can no longer support aging parents. The Greek captain, blacklisted by legitimate operators, may never command vessels again. Enforcement officials acknowledge collateral damage while defending operational necessity. National security requires hard choices that inevitably harm innocent parties. Alternative approaches risk greater suffering across larger populations, they argue. The machinery grinds forward regardless. Individuals become statistics in classified briefings. Policy debates continue in comfortable conference rooms while detained sailors await uncertain futures in foreign detention facilities. Beijing issued condemnation within hours of the seizure. Foreign ministry spokesmen termed the operation economic imperialism, threatening international commerce. State media amplified criticism across 3 continents, framing the incident as American overreach. Russia's Duma passed symbolic resolutions questioning U.S. maritime jurisdiction and hinting at potential countermeasures. European allies responded cautiously, caught between competing pressures. Germany expressed concern through diplomatic channels while maintaining public silence. France briefed concerns privately to Washington officials. NATO members faced difficult calculations, alliance obligations versus independent trade interests and energy security needs. Your economic connections extend globally through complex supply chains. International trade relies fundamentally on predictable rules and stable enforcement frameworks. When major powers dispute maritime law fundamentals, uncertainty spreads rapidly. Supply chains recalibrate. Insurance costs escalate significantly. Risk premiums increase across multiple sectors simultaneously. Geopolitical risk assessments suggest consequences compound over time. When dominant powers enforce rules unilaterally without broad consensus, rivals develop sophisticated countermeasures. The Dark Fleet expanded from approximately 370 vessels to over 1,650 by mid-2025, demonstrating how enforcement pressure drives adaptation rather than compliance. Defenders argue strength deters further violations effectively. State Department officials cite reduced Iranian tanker movements following enforcement escalation. Without decisive action, they contend, weakness invites exploitation by authoritarian regimes. Resolve maintains international order. Critics counter that legitimate order requires consensus among major powers. Unilateral enforcement fractures international cooperation over time. Alternative power centers emerge when perceived legitimacy erodes. Fragmented enforcement between U.S., EU, and UK jurisdictions creates regulatory gaps that enable sophisticated evasion. Strategic choke points face increased tension. Strait of Hormuz, Malacca Strait, Suez Canal. Naval positioning shifts as regional powers assert presence. The skipper seizure tested more than sanctions effectiveness. It questioned fundamental assumptions about who governs global commons during contested geopolitical periods. 3 futures emerge from the skipper incident. Each carries distinct probabilities. None offers comfortable resolution for policymakers or affected populations. Scenario 1, escalation. Iran and Venezuela deepen cooperation beyond current levels. China provides financial infrastructure completely beyond U.S. reach. The Dark Fleet expands to over 1,000 vessels operating across multiple regions. Enforcement becomes impossible without direct military interdiction. Risk of armed confrontation between major powers increases exponentially. Scenario 2. Diplomatic reset. Sanctions prove economically unsustainable for all parties involved. Negotiations produce limited sanctions relief in exchange for behavioral modifications. Sanctioned regimes modify conduct incrementally rather than fundamentally. Trade normalizes partially. Enforcement pressure gradually reduces. Critics dismiss this scenario as unrealistic. Authoritarian regimes don't compromise under pressure, they argue. Historical precedent suggests entrenchment rather than accommodation. Defenders counter that sustained economic pain eventually forces pragmatic recalibration regardless of regime ideology. Scenario 3. Shadow permanence. Current tensions persist indefinitely without resolution. Sanctioned trade neither expands dramatically nor disappears entirely. Enforcement captures occasional vessels demonstrating capability. Evasion techniques evolve continuously in response. Markets adapt to perpetual uncertainty as the new normal. Analyst consensus suggests shadow permanence carries highest probability at approximately 45%. Escalation follows at 35%. Diplomatic reset appears least likely at 20%. Your financial exposure extends across all scenarios inevitably. Sustained instability in sanctioned oil regions could drive 15% price volatility short-term at consumer level. Gasoline costs fluctuate unpredictably month to month. Household budgets absorb repeated shocks. Tax increases fund enforcement infrastructure. $340 million annually for AI-enhanced targeting systems alone. Defenders emphasize security imperatives override economic costs. Sanctioned regimes fund activities threatening international stability fundamentally. Short-term economic pain prevents long-term catastrophe. Skeptics question whether enforcement achieves stated objectives. Venezuela and Iran remain defiant despite decades of pressure. Dark fleets expand despite interdictions. Technology enables evasion faster than detection capabilities improve. The Skipper was one vessel. 600 more operate in shadows currently. The shadow energy war continues regardless of diplomatic rhetoric.